Andrei Chikatilo case. Butcher of Rostov. Inside the mind of a serial killer. Introduction. In the vast expanse of the Soviet Union during the 1980s, where state propaganda proclaimed the elimination of crime under communist ideology, a monster prowled the railways and forests of the Rostov region. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, a seemingly ordinary teacher and factory worker, harbored within himself one of the most disturbing and prolific killing sprees in criminal history. Known as the Butcher of Rostov, the Red Ripper, and the Rostov Ripper, Chikatilo would terrorize the Soviet Union for over a decade, claiming at least 53 confirmed victims, though investigators believe the true number may exceed 56. What makes Chikatilo's case particularly chilling is not merely the scale of his crimes, but the systematic brutality with which he carried them out. His victims, primarily children, teenagers, and young women, were subjected to unimaginable torture, sexual violence, and mutilation. The killer's modus operandi involved luring vulnerable individuals to secluded areas near railway stations, where he would unleash his sadistic fantasies with a level of violence that shocked even seasoned investigators. The Chikatilo case exposed the dark underbelly of Soviet society, revealing how ideological denial and bureaucratic incompetence allowed a serial killer to operate virtually unchecked for 12 years. The investigation, hampered by political pressure to maintain the facade of a crime-free socialist state, became one of the largest manhunts in Soviet history, involving thousands of officers and resulting in the wrongful execution of an innocent man. Born in 1936 in the Ukrainian village of Yabluchne, Chikatilo's story begins in the shadow of Stalin's man-made famine, the Holodomor, which claimed millions of lives and left lasting psychological scars on survivors. His childhood, marked by poverty, humiliation, and alleged cannibalism within his own family, would plant the seeds of the monster he would become. This case has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and films, including the acclaimed movie Citizen X, and multiple psychological studies attempting to understand the mind behind such incomprehensible evil. Each examination struggles with the same fundamental question. How does a human being transform into such a creature of darkness, and what societal failures allowed him to continue his reign of terror for so long? If you're drawn to understanding the psychology behind history's most notorious criminals, make sure to follow this channel. Because the journey into Andrei Chikatilo's mind reveals not just the making of a monster, but the systemic failures that enabled his crimes. The origins. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the small village of Yabluchne in the Sumy Oblast of Ukraine during one of the darkest periods in Soviet history. His birth coincided with the aftermath of the Holodomor, Stalin's engineered famine that had devastated Ukraine between 1932 and 1933. Killing millions and leaving the survivors psychologically scarred and traumatized. The specter of starvation, cannibalism, and death hung over Chikatilo's earliest years, creating a foundation of horror that would profoundly shape his psychological development. The Chikatilo family lived in abject poverty in a one-room hut, struggling to survive in the post-famine landscape. Andrei's father, Roman Chikatilo, was a collective farm worker who would later be conscripted into the Red Army during World War II, only to be captured by German forces and spend years in a prisoner of war camp. His mother, Anna, was a stern, deeply religious woman who dominated the household with an iron fist, instilling in young Andrei a complex relationship with authority, sexuality, and violence that would prove catastrophic. One of the most significant and disturbing elements of Chikatilo's early life was the persistent family legend surrounding his older brother, Stepan. According to family lore, which Andrei's mother repeatedly told him, Stepan had been kidnapped and cannibalized by starving neighbors during the famine. Whether this story was true or a product of trauma-induced mythology, it became a central fixture in Andrei's psychological landscape, creating an early association between violence, consumption, and survival that would later manifest in his crimes. Chikatilo's childhood was marked by chronic bedwetting, a condition that persisted well into his teenage years and became a source of intense shame and humiliation. His mother's response to these incidents was brutal, beating him severely and publicly shaming him, creating deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and sexual confusion. The bedwetting, combined with his mother's harsh treatment, established patterns of shame, violence, and sexual dysfunction that would plague him throughout his life. During World War II, when Andrei was still a young child, the family endured the German occupation of Ukraine. The war brought additional trauma, including witnessing violence, experiencing severe food shortages, and living in constant fear. His father's absence during military service and subsequent imprisonment left Andrei without a stable male role model, while his mother's increasingly erratic and violent behavior created an atmosphere of unpredictability and fear in the household. Academically, Chikatilo showed promise despite his troubled home life. He was an avid reader with a particular interest in literature and history, often escaping into books as a refuge from his harsh reality. However, his social development was severely stunted. He was painfully shy, wore thick glasses that made him a target for bullying, and struggled to form meaningful relationships with peers. The combination of extreme poverty, family trauma, maternal abuse, and social isolation created a perfect storm of psychological dysfunction. By adolescence, Chikatilo had developed disturbing sexual fantasies that combined violence with arousal, a pattern that would later escalate into his horrific crimes. The young man who emerged from this traumatic childhood carried within him a volatile mixture of intelligence, rage, sexual dysfunction, and a profound disconnection from normal human empathy. All the ingredients necessary for the monster he would become. The first signs. As Chikatilo entered adolescence and young adulthood, the psychological damage from his childhood began to manifest in increasingly disturbing ways. His teenage years were marked by social awkwardness, sexual dysfunction, and the first glimpses of the violent fantasies that would later consume him. Despite his academic abilities, he struggled to gain admission to Moscow University due to his family's poor political standing. His father's capture during the war was viewed with suspicion by Soviet authorities. Instead, Chikatilo was forced to settle for a correspondence course in Russian literature from Rostov University, a disappointment that fueled his growing resentment towards society and authority. During this period, he began experiencing severe sexual dysfunction, including impotence, which became a source of intense shame and rage. His attempts at romantic relationships were disasters, often ending in humiliation when his sexual inadequacies became apparent. In 1963, at the age of 27, Chikatilo married Feodosia Odnacheva, a marriage arranged by his younger sister who was concerned about his inability to find a partner independently. The marriage was largely sexless, with Chikatilo's impotence making normal intimacy impossible. However, through what he later described as violent encounters, the couple managed to conceive 2 children. These sexual experiences, characterized by aggression and force rather than tenderness, reinforced Chikatilo's association between violence and sexual gratification. After completing his education, Chikatilo began working as a school teacher, a profession that would provide him with access to potential victims and a veneer of respectability. However, his teaching career was marked by inappropriate behavior and disturbing incidents. Students complained about his strange conduct, including allegations of sexual impropriety and bizarre punishments. Parents began to notice their children's discomfort around him, and several schools eventually forced him to resign due to his inappropriate behavior with students. The pattern of his teaching career revealed early warning signs of his predatory nature. Chikatilo was particularly drawn to vulnerable students, those from broken homes, runaways, or children who seemed isolated from their peers. He would often offer extra help or special attention to these students, behavior that initially appeared caring but gradually revealed itself as grooming behavior characteristic of sexual predators. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, Chikatilo began experiencing what he later described as violent sexual fantasies involving children and young people. These fantasies became increasingly elaborate and disturbing, often involving scenarios of complete domination, violence, and death. He found himself unable to achieve sexual arousal through normal means, requiring increasingly violent and disturbing mental imagery to reach satisfaction. His first known sexual assault occurred in 1973, when he molested a young student at one of the schools where he taught. The incident was covered up by school authorities, who were more concerned with avoiding scandal than protecting students. This cover-up sent a dangerous message to Chikatilo that his behavior, while inappropriate, would not necessarily result in serious consequences. By the mid-1970s, Chikatilo had established a pattern of predatory behavior, sexual dysfunction channeled into violence, and a growing sense of entitlement to act on his darkest impulses. The psychological foundation for his transformation into one of history's most prolific serial killers was now firmly in place, requiring only the right circumstances to trigger the beginning of his killing spree. The crime. On December 22, 1978, Andrei Chikatilo crossed the line from sexual predator to murderer, claiming his first known victim in a crime that would establish the horrific pattern for dozens of murders to follow. 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova was walking home from school in the town of Shakti when Chikatilo approached her near a railway station, a location that would become synonymous with his hunting grounds throughout his criminal career. Chikatilo had been stalking the area around schools and transportation hubs, observing potential victims and waiting for the right opportunity. Lena, small for her age and walking alone, represented the perfect target for his first kill. Using his practiced ability to appear harmless and authoritative, skills honed during his years as a teacher, he convinced the child to follow him to an abandoned shed he had purchased specifically for this purpose. What occurred in that shed defied human comprehension. Chikatilo subjected the young girl to brutal sexual assault, torture, and mutilation before finally killing her. The level of violence was extraordinary even by the standards of violent crime, involving extensive cutting, stabbing, and dismemberment. Most disturbing of all, evidence suggested that Chikatilo had engaged in acts of cannibalism, consuming parts of his victim's body in a grotesque fulfillment of the childhood trauma surrounding his brother's alleged fate. The discovery of Lena's mutilated body sent shockwaves through the local community and marked the beginning of one of the Soviet Union's most intensive criminal investigations. However, the political climate of the late 1970s created significant obstacles to effective police work. The Soviet ideology maintained that such brutal crimes were products of capitalist decadence and could not exist in a socialist society, leading to pressure on investigators to find quick solutions that would not challenge this narrative. In a tragic miscarriage of justice that would haunt the investigation for years, police arrested Alexander Kravchenko, a 25-year-old man with a previous conviction for rape. Despite a lack of physical evidence connecting him to the crime, Kravchenko was coerced into confessing through brutal interrogation methods. He was subsequently executed for Lena's murder, while the real killer remained free to continue his reign of terror. Chikatilo's success in evading capture for his first murder emboldened him and confirmed his belief that he could continue killing without consequence. The wrongful execution of an innocent man also provided him with a psychological shield, as investigators initially assumed the case was closed and were slow to recognize the pattern when similar murders began occurring. The murder of Lena Zakotnova established Chikatilo's modus operandi, targeting vulnerable individuals near transportation hubs, using his ability to appear trustworthy to lure victims to secluded locations, and then unleashing extreme violence that combined sexual assault with torture, mutilation, and cannibalism. This first crime also revealed his preference for victims who represented innocence and vulnerability. Children, teenagers, and young women who reminded him of his own powerless childhood. The 3-year gap between this first murder and his next confirmed kill allowed Chikatilo to refine his methods and develop the psychological justifications that would enable him to continue killing. The failure of the Soviet justice system to properly investigate this first murder, combined with the execution of an innocent man, created the perfect conditions for Chikatilo to begin the systematic killing spree that would terrorize the region for over a decade. The reaction. The discovery of Lena Zakotnova's mutilated body in December 1978 sent waves of terror through the tight-knit community of Shakhty. But the public reaction was carefully controlled by Soviet authorities determined to maintain the facade of a crime-free socialist society. The brutal nature of the murder, involving sexual assault, torture, and mutilation of a child, was so shocking that local officials struggled to comprehend how such a crime could occur in their supposedly perfect society. Initial media coverage was minimal and heavily censored, with authorities providing only basic details about the discovery of a child's body while suppressing the horrific specifics of the crime. The Soviet press, controlled entirely by the state, was forbidden from reporting details that might suggest the existence of serious violent crime, as such reports contradicted the official narrative that capitalist societies bred violence while socialist societies eliminated it. The local community's reaction was one of fear and confusion, with parents suddenly reluctant to allow their children to walk alone or play unsupervised. Schools implemented new safety protocols, and the railway stations where Chikatilo hunted became places of heightened anxiety. However, the lack of accurate information from authorities left residents vulnerable, as they were unaware of the specific dangers they faced or the type of predator operating in their midst. When Alexander Kravchenko was arrested and subsequently executed for the crime, the official narrative proclaimed that justice had been served and the community was safe. This false resolution had devastating consequences, as it not only cost an innocent man his life, but also created a dangerous sense of security that allowed Chikatilo to continue operating undetected. The psychological impact on the investigative team was profound, particularly after it became clear that they had executed the wrong man. Detective Major Mikhail Fetisov, who led the initial investigation, later described the crushing weight of realizing their mistake and the pressure from superiors to find quick solutions rather than thorough ones. The wrongful execution created a culture of fear within the police force, where investigators became reluctant to make arrests without overwhelming evidence. As similar murders began occurring in the early 1980s, the pattern of official denial continued. Each new victim was treated as an isolated incident, with authorities refusing to acknowledge the possibility of a serial killer operating in their territory. This denial was not merely bureaucratic incompetence, but a deliberate policy designed to protect the Soviet Union's international reputation and maintain domestic stability. If this story has captured your attention, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who are fascinated by true crime, because the investigation that followed would reveal not just the hunt for a killer, but the systematic failures of an entire society. The families of victims found themselves caught between grief and frustration, as authorities provided little information about the investigations and seemed more concerned with maintaining secrecy than finding the killer. The international community remained largely unaware of the growing crisis, as the Soviet Union's closed society prevented foreign journalists from reporting on the crimes. As the body count continued to rise throughout the early 1980s, the gap between official denials and growing public fear created a climate of paranoia and mistrust that would persist long after Chikatilo's eventual capture. The investigation. The investigation into what would eventually be recognized as the Chikatilo murders began in earnest in 1982, when the accumulation of similar crimes finally forced Soviet authorities to acknowledge that a serial killer was operating in the Rostov region. Detective Inspector Isa Kostoyev was assigned to lead what would become one of the largest and most complex criminal investigations in Soviet history, involving thousands of officers and spanning over a decade. The challenge facing investigators was unprecedented in Soviet law enforcement. The communist system had no framework for understanding or investigating serial murder, as such crimes were theoretically impossible under socialist ideology. This ideological blindness created significant obstacles, as investigators were forced to develop new methodologies while working under intense political pressure to solve the case quickly and quietly. The investigation team, eventually led by the experienced detective Viktor Burakov, began by attempting to establish connections between the growing number of victims. What emerged was a disturbing pattern. Most victims were children, teenagers, or young women who had disappeared near railway stations or bus stops. The bodies, when found, showed evidence of extreme violence, including sexual assault, torture, mutilation, and in many cases, cannibalism. Burakov and his team developed a geographical profile of the crimes, noting that murders occurred along major transportation routes throughout the Rostov region and beyond. This pattern suggested that the killer was highly mobile, possibly using the extensive Soviet railway system to travel between hunting grounds. The geographical spread of the crimes also indicated that the perpetrator was familiar with the region and comfortable moving through different communities. The forensic evidence was limited by the technology available in the Soviet Union during the 1980s. DNA analysis was not yet available, and many crime scenes had been contaminated or inadequately preserved. However, investigators were able to establish that the same weapon, likely a knife with a distinctive blade pattern, had been used in multiple murders. They also noted the killer's apparent knowledge of anatomy, suggesting possible medical or veterinary training. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from the psychological profile developed by Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, a psychiatrist who studied the crime scenes and victim patterns. Bukhanovsky's analysis suggested that the killer was a middle-aged man with sexual dysfunction, likely married with children, and possibly employed in a position that required travel. This profile, remarkably accurate in retrospect, helped focus the investigation on specific types of suspects. The investigation was hampered by several false leads and wrongful arrests, including the tragic case of Alexander Kravchenko. The pressure to solve the case led to the arrest of numerous innocent individuals, some of whom were subjected to brutal interrogation methods that resulted in false confessions. These mistakes not only cost innocent lives, but also diverted resources from the actual investigation. A major breakthrough occurred in 1984, when investigators began focusing on individuals who had access to transportation and travelled frequently throughout the region. This led them to examine railway workers, travelling salesmen, and other professionals whose jobs required mobility. However, Chikatilo's ability to maintain a normal facade and his lack of a serious criminal record allowed him to avoid suspicion during these early sweeps. The investigation team also struggled with jurisdictional issues, as the crimes occurred across multiple administrative regions within the Soviet Union. Coordination between different police forces was often poor, and information sharing was limited by bureaucratic rivalries and political considerations. Despite these obstacles, the investigation gradually narrowed its focus through painstaking detective work and the development of increasingly sophisticated surveillance techniques. The team began monitoring railway stations and other transportation hubs, looking for suspicious individuals who matched their psychological profile. The persistence of investigators like Burakov, combined with advances in forensic techniques and the eventual cooperation of multiple agencies, slowly built the foundation for Chikatilo's eventual capture. The judgment. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo began on April 14, 1992, in a specially constructed courtroom in Rostov-on-Don, designed to accommodate the massive public interest and ensure security during what would become one of the most significant criminal trials in Russian history. The proceedings were presided over by Judge Leonid Akubzhanov, who faced the unprecedented challenge of trying a man accused of 53 murders spanning over a decade. Chikatilo entered the courtroom in a specially constructed iron cage, a precaution deemed necessary due to his unpredictable behavior and the intense public hatred directed toward him. His appearance shocked observers. The once imposing figure had become gaunt and wild-eyed, his behavior erratic and often incoherent. Throughout the trial, he would alternate between periods of apparent lucidity and episodes of bizarre conduct, including removing his shoes, waving them at the judge, and making incomprehensible statements. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Alexei Kovalyov, methodically presented evidence linking Chikatilo to each of the 53 murders. The case against him was overwhelming, eyewitness testimony placing him near crime scenes, physical evidence including personal items found in his possession, and his own detailed confessions that included information only the killer could have known. The prosecution painted a picture of a methodical predator who had terrorized the region for over a decade. Chikatilo's defense team, appointed by the court, faced an almost impossible task. Their client had confessed to the crimes in detail, and the evidence against him was substantial. Their strategy centered on arguing that Chikatilo was mentally ill and therefore not responsible for his actions. They presented psychiatric testimony suggesting that he suffered from severe mental disorders that impaired his ability to control his behavior or understand the nature of his crimes. The psychiatric evaluation of Chikatilo became a central focus of the trial. Dr. Alexander Buchanovsky, the same psychiatrist who had helped create the psychological profile used to catch the killer, testified about Chikatilo's mental state. He described a man suffering from multiple psychiatric disorders, including sexual sadism, necrophilia, and various personality disorders that had developed from his traumatic childhood experiences. However, the prosecution successfully argued that despite his mental illness, Chikatilo was aware of the nature of his crimes and had taken steps to avoid capture, demonstrating that he understood the wrongfulness of his actions. They pointed to his ability to maintain employment, relationships, and a facade of normalcy as evidence that he retained sufficient mental capacity to be held responsible for his crimes. The trial also revealed the full scope of the investigation's failures and the systemic problems that had allowed Chikatilo to continue killing for so long. Testimony from investigators detailed the political pressure they had faced, the wrongful arrests and executions, and the bureaucratic obstacles that had hampered their efforts. Victim impact statements from families provided some of the most emotionally powerful moments of the trial. Parents, siblings, and other relatives described the devastating impact of losing their loved ones and the additional trauma of years of uncertainty and failed investigations. Many expressed anger not only at Chikatilo, but at the system that had failed to protect their children. On October 15, 1992, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 52 counts of murder. One charge was dropped due to insufficient evidence. Judge Akubzhanov sentenced Chikatilo to death, a decision that was met with approval from the packed courtroom and the broader public. The trial's conclusion brought a sense of closure to the families of victims and the broader community, but it also highlighted the enormous human cost of the systemic failures that had allowed Chikatilo to operate for so long. Prison and reflection. Following his conviction and death sentence, Andrei Chikatilo was transferred to a special isolation unit in Novocherkassk prison, where he would spend his final years awaiting execution. The man who had terrorized the Soviet Union for over a decade now found himself confined to a small cell, stripped of the freedom that had allowed him to hunt and kill with impunity for so long. Prison officials described Chikatilo as a model prisoner who caused few disciplinary problems, a stark contrast to his erratic behavior during the trial. He spent most of his time reading, writing letters, and reflecting on his crimes, though his writings revealed little genuine remorse for his victims. Instead, his correspondence and statements to prison psychiatrists showed a man who remained largely focused on his own suffering and perceived persecution. The psychological evaluations conducted during his imprisonment provided additional insights into his mental state. Dr. Buchanovsky and other psychiatrists who examined him noted that Chikatilo showed signs of progressive mental deterioration, possibly related to the stress of confinement and the weight of his crimes. His ability to maintain the facade of normalcy that had served him so well during his killing spree had completely collapsed. Chikatilo's letters to his family, particularly his wife and children, revealed a man struggling to maintain relationships that had been irrevocably damaged by his crimes. His wife Feodosia had divorced him shortly after his arrest, unable to reconcile the man she had lived with for decades with the monster revealed in court. His children, now adults, faced the challenge of living with the knowledge that their father was one of history's most notorious serial killers. In his conversations with prison chaplains and psychiatrists, Chikatilo occasionally expressed what appeared to be remorse for his actions, but these statements were often contradicted by other comments that suggested he still harbored violent fantasies. His mental state remained unstable, with periods of apparent clarity alternating with episodes of confusion and bizarre behavior. The isolation of prison life seemed to intensify Chikatilo's introspective tendencies, and he spent considerable time attempting to understand and explain his own actions. However, his self-analysis was often distorted by self-pity and a tendency to blame external factors for his crimes. He frequently cited his traumatic childhood, his sexual dysfunction, and various societal pressures as explanations for his behavior, while showing little genuine understanding of the suffering he had caused. Subscribe to this channel if you want to explore more cases that delve into the psychology of killers, because understanding the mind behind the crime is often more disturbing than the crime itself. As his execution date approached, Chikatilo's behavior became increasingly erratic. He alternated between periods of apparent acceptance of his fate and episodes of denial and rage. His final appeals for clemency were rejected by Russian authorities, who determined that the severity of his crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. The man who had once wielded the power of life and death over dozens of innocent victims now faced the prospect of his own execution, stripped of the control that had defined his criminal career. The mind of the criminal. The psychological profile of Andrei Chikatilo presents one of the most complex and disturbing cases in the study of criminal psychology, revealing how childhood trauma, sexual dysfunction, and societal factors can combine to create a monster of unprecedented brutality. Unlike many serial killers who are driven primarily by power or sexual gratification, Chikatilo's crimes were motivated by a unique combination of psychological factors that made him particularly dangerous and difficult to understand. Dr. Alexander Buchanovsky's extensive psychological analysis of Chikatilo identified several key factors that contributed to his transformation into a serial killer. The most significant was the severe childhood trauma he experienced, including the alleged cannibalization of his brother during the Holodomor, his mother's brutal treatment, and the general atmosphere of violence and deprivation that characterized his early years. These experiences created what Buchanovsky termed a death imprint, a psychological template that associated violence with survival and power. Chikatilo's sexual dysfunction played a crucial role in his psychological development and criminal behavior. His inability to achieve normal sexual satisfaction led him to associate arousal with violence and domination. The shame and humiliation he felt about his impotence created a deep-seated rage that he eventually channeled into his crimes. His attacks on victims were not merely acts of violence, but desperate attempts to achieve the sexual gratification that eluded him in normal relationships. The concept of displaced cannibalism is central to understanding Chikatilo's psychology. His childhood exposure to stories of cannibalism during the famine, combined with his own feelings of powerlessness and hunger, both literal and metaphorical, created a psychological framework in which consuming his victims represented the ultimate expression of power and control. The cannibalistic aspects of his crimes were not random acts of violence, but symbolic attempts to internalize the power and innocence of his victims. Psychological evaluations revealed that Chikatilo exhibited traits consistent with multiple personality disorders, including antisocial personality disorder, sexual sadism disorder, and various paraphilias. However, his case was complicated by the fact that he was able to maintain a relatively normal facade for decades, holding jobs, maintaining a marriage, and raising children while simultaneously committing horrific crimes. The role of fantasy in Chikatilo's psychological development cannot be overstated. His violent sexual fantasies, which began in adolescence, gradually became more elaborate and specific over time. These fantasies served as a form of psychological rehearsal for his crimes, allowing him to plan and refine his methods while providing temporary satisfaction for his disturbed urges. The progression from fantasy to action represents a critical escalation that many serial killers experience. Chikatilo's intelligence and education also played a role in his criminal career. His ability to read and understand human behavior, honed during his years as a teacher, made him an effective predator, capable of identifying and manipulating vulnerable victims. His knowledge of literature and history may have provided him with additional psychological frameworks for understanding and justifying his actions. The social and political context of Soviet society also contributed to Chikatilo's development as a serial killer. The repressive nature of the communist system, with its emphasis on conformity and denial of individual psychological problems, prevented him from receiving the mental health treatment that might have prevented his crimes. The societal taboos surrounding sexuality and mental illness created an environment where his problems festered in isolation. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that Chikatilo derived genuine pleasure from his crimes, not just from the sexual violence, but from the complete domination and destruction of his victims. His ability to compartmentalize his crimes and maintain a normal life suggests a level of psychological sophistication that made him particularly dangerous. The case of Andrei Chikatilo demonstrates how multiple factors, childhood trauma, sexual dysfunction, social isolation, and possible neurological abnormalities, can combine to create an individual capable of extraordinary evil. Mysterious and reflective conclusion. On February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head in Novocherkassk prison, bringing to an end one of the most horrific criminal careers in modern history. The timing of his execution, whether intentional or coincidental, carried a grim irony. A day traditionally associated with love and human connection, marking the final moment of a man who had embodied the complete absence of both. His execution was carried out in secret, with only a handful of officials present and no advance notice given to the media or public. This secrecy was maintained partly for security reasons, but also reflected the Soviet and early Russian approach to such matters: swift, final, and without ceremony. Chikatilo's body was buried in an unmarked grave, his final resting place kept secret to prevent it from becoming a macabre shrine or tourist attraction. The investigation into Chikatilo's crimes continued even after his death, as authorities worked to identify additional victims and close unsolved cases that might be connected to his killing spree. The final official count stood at 53 confirmed murders, but investigators believe the true number may have been higher, with some cases remaining unsolved due to insufficient evidence or the destruction of records during the chaotic transition from Soviet to post-Soviet Russia. The psychological questions surrounding Chikatilo's case remain as compelling today as they were during his trial. How does a human being become capable of such systematic brutality? What combination of factors, biological, psychological, and social, creates a monster of such proportions? The answers lie in the complex intersection of childhood trauma, sexual dysfunction, mental illness, and societal failure that characterized his life and crimes. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Chikatilo case is how it forces us to confront the capacity for evil that exists within human nature. Unlike fictional monsters or supernatural villains, Chikatilo was undeniably human. A man who lived among ordinary people, held jobs, raised a family, and maintained the appearance of normalcy while committing acts of unimaginable brutality. This duality challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of evil and our ability to recognize it in our midst. The legacy of Andrei Chikatilo extends far beyond his individual crimes. His case led to significant changes in Soviet and Russian law enforcement practices, including improved coordination between jurisdictions, better training for investigators dealing with serial crimes, and the development of psychological profiling techniques. These reforms represent society's attempt to prevent another Chikatilo, but they also serve as a reminder of the systemic failures that enabled his crimes. The families of his victims continue to live with the consequences of his actions, their lives forever altered by encounters with pure evil. Many have struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why their loved ones were chosen while others were spared. The randomness of his victim selection adds another layer of horror to his crimes, suggesting that anyone could have fallen prey to his violence. In the end, Andrei Chikatilo remains a dark enigma wrapped in the mundane facade of a Soviet citizen. He was neither the obvious monster that popular culture often portrays serial killers to be, nor the product of a single traumatic event that might explain his transformation. He was something far more disturbing, a reminder that the capacity for systematic evil can develop gradually, hidden behind a mask of normalcy, and that the signs of such development can be missed or ignored by the very systems designed to protect society. The question that haunts those who study his case is not just how he killed so many, but how he was able to live with himself while doing it. The answer may lie in the possibility that, for Chikatilo, the act of killing had become so central to his identity and psychological functioning that he genuinely could not conceive of existing without it. In his twisted worldview, his victims were not human beings deserving of life and dignity, but objects to be consumed in his desperate quest for power and sexual satisfaction. This dehumanization of victims, perhaps more than any other aspect of his psychology, reveals the true horror of the Chikatilo case. It suggests that the greatest monsters are not those who kill in passion or rage, but those who have systematically eliminated their capacity for empathy and human connection. The forests and railway stations of the Rostov region, once hunting grounds for a predator of unimaginable cruelty, have returned to their normal function as places of transit and natural beauty. But for those who remember, these locations will forever be haunted by the memory of the man who turned them into scenes of horror. If this story has intrigued you, subscribe to this channel to explore other real crimes that shocked the world and the minds behind them.